Chapter 25, The Great Depression. Section 3, Americans Face Hard Times. Hard times that the farmers endured began before the Depression even hit. It began in the 1920s because prices for farm products were going down and remained low for much of the decade. What made it worse was in the early 1930s, a severe drought hit the Great Plains, and it lasted from the majority of the decade. Crops started to wither away, and then when winds blew across the Great Plains, it picked up the loose soil because there's no roots from the plants to keep the soil in place, and you had massive dust storms that swept over the region. This region became known as the Dust Bowl. As you can see from these pictures, those dust storms were pretty bad. I mean, just imagine you being in this town right here, and all that big cloud of dust is heading right toward you. It's kind of ominous looking. We're going to look at this map, show you the region here where that occurred. The yellow area is part of the Great Plains, where dust storms did hit, but the severest storms, I don't know if severest is a word, but the worst storms came right in this orange area right here. That's where the Dust Bowl was. And then because of the Dust Bowl, you can see the migration routes of many people who left the Great Plains area. Farmers cannot raise crops, obviously, and so they cannot pay for their mortgages on their farms, which means that they lost their farms. Now, the government tried to assist these farmers by offering something like price stabilization, meaning prices wouldn't go down or up, they'd stay the same. They made loans to farmers, and there were also some advances in soil conservation and new farming methods, but it really was too little too late by the time the dust storm hit. And so over 2.5 million farmers and people living in the Great Plains left the region. You can see the results of those dust storms: places buried, cars buried, homes underneath dirt. A lot of those homes, dirt was going into their houses. So, you had dirt inside your house. So a lot of times people were sitting in dirt or sleeping in dirt or possibly eating in dirt. The dust particles were all over the place. The Depression took a heavy toll on families all over the country. These families, having faced hard times, are going to be forced to split up on a number of occasions looking for work. They're roaming the country looking for work. Even children had to drop out of school so that they could find some kind of job to help out the family. Or even at the worst, these children were forced to leave home to fend for themselves because the parents just couldn't afford to pay for them. As more and more white families were moving out west to find work, it was harder and harder for immigrants like Mexican Americans to find work because they had all those field jobs or farm jobs, but then as white families moved out there, they were taking over those jobs that Americans had worked. For example, in California, local leaders and unions convinced the government of California to deport many Mexican-born workers and their children, many of which were U.S. citizens because they were born in the United States. African Americans will also face discrimination. Many will lose their jobs to unemployed white workers, but despite of all that, some were able to find some jobs through relief programs that the government passed, like the CCC or the WPA. African American leaders acted as advisors for President Roosevelt, like a woman named Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the actual first African American in a cabinet position. And his African American advisors became known as the Black Cabinet, as you can see in this picture. There's Mary McLeod Bethune right there. One of the programs that Roosevelt created was the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, and some of the jobs that were issued in the WPA were for artists, painters, sculptors, writers, actors. All these people were put to work, if you will, through the WPA. Part of their mission was to help create a record of life during the Depression. So you have writers like John Steinbeck, who you see right here in this picture, who wrote a very famous book called The Grapes of Wrath. It's about the Depression and living in the Depression. Or you have writers that sing songs like Woody Guthrie here, who wrote a very famous song called This Land Is Your Land. They explored themes of depression, life, loss, and struggle. A form of music kind of blossomed during the 1930s, and that was swing music, and that really helped people forget their troubles and lifted their spirits. Radios became extremely popular during this time period. It provided an inexpensive entertainment with music shows or popular, like serial shows. And I don't mean serial like Cheerios, but I mean a serial is like sort of like a soap opera show on the radio. For example, like A Little Orphan Annie would be a popular one. Photographer Dorothea Lange, who you see in this picture right here, she gained fame for documenting the conditions of the poor. She took many pictures of people during the Depression. This is a picture, if you recall the first slide of this video, a very famous picture called Migrant Mother. That's just her documenting the conditions of the poor. Movies were created. So movies are just starting to really become popular, and that was another way for Americans to escape reality. One popular movie in the 1930s, The Wizard of Oz. The effects of the New Deal. It had long-reaching effects. Well, it gave Americans help and hope in a time of severe crisis. Something that I think the people didn't feel under Herbert Hoover. Now, whether it worked or not is a different story, but it did give a sense of help and hope. Now, some people might argue that expanding the role of the federal government is not a good thing, but because of the expanded role, they got all these programs passed, which did help people. Two New Deal programs that were passed are still around today. There's a couple, but Social Security is still around today, and the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that protects the savings of bank customers. So if you read this, it says each depositor insured to $100,000. So these are two programs from the New Deal that still exist today. This is something you would find in a bank door possibly. So keep an eye out for that. That is the end of Section 3.